I don't know what you think you're doing in this section, but I've had my eye on you since you walked in." The voice belonged to Craig Novak. He was the floor manager of Whitmore's, a mid-range department store in the Eastfield Mall in Columbus, Ohio, and he said those words loud enough to be heard by everyone within 30 feet. The woman he said them to had been standing at the end of the housewares aisle, holding a single copper-bottomed saucepan, reading the label with the quiet focus of someone who knew exactly what she was looking for. She set the pan back on the shelf slowly. She did not startle. She did not argue. She simply turned and looked at Craig Novak with an expression so composed it seemed almost geological. Something pressed into shape over a very long time. Craig Novak was not finished. He crossed his arms and said, "We've had issues with theft in this section. I'm going to need you to come with me to the service desk." He said it the way a man says something he has said before and never been challenged on. Behind him, 2 customers near the blender display went still. A woman in a yellow cardigan stopped pushing her cart. A teenage boy in the next aisle peered through the gap between the shelving units. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. What Craig Novak did not know, what none of them knew, was who she was, what she carried in her bag, what her name meant to the company that owned the building he worked in. Stay with this one to the end. Every detail is here for a reason. When the truth came out, Craig Novak would not simply be embarrassed, he would be finished. But before we get there, let me take you back to the beginning. Let me show you who she really was and how she came to be standing in that aisle with a copper saucepan in her hand and a composure that could not be shaken. Her name was Denise Okafor, and she had been building toward that moment for 22 years without anyone watching. Now, here's what most people did not know about Denise Okafor. She had grown up in the Linden neighborhood of Columbus in a house on Myrtle Avenue, where the porch boards creaked in a specific pattern her mother had memorized. 2 short, 1 long, so she always knew when Denise was coming home. Her mother, Gloria Okafor, had worked the early shift at a commercial laundry for 19 years. She smelled of steam and clean cotton every morning and of exhaustion every evening, and she never once complained about either. Gloria had one piece of counsel she repeated from the time Denise was old enough to understand it. She said it at the kitchen table, over homework. She said it at the bus stop in the cold. She said it the morning Denise left for Ohio State on a partial scholarship with a duffel bag and $40 in her pocket. "Stay low," Gloria said. "Build high. Let the work speak when you can't." Denise had taken that the way you take in something demonstrated to you, not just spoken. She had watched her mother stay low her entire life. She had watched the work accumulate. She understood the instruction at a cellular level. At Ohio State, Denise studied business administration with a concentration in retail operations. She was not the loudest student in any room. She was the one who read the supplemental texts, the one who asked the professor to clarify the clause in the distribution contract that everyone else had skimmed past. She graduated in the top 8% of her class, took a junior analyst position at a regional retail consulting firm called Meridian Group, and spent the next 6 years learning every mechanism by which a retail chain either grew or collapsed. Inventory systems, loss prevention audits, vendor negotiations, the particular way mid-market department stores hemorrhaged margin through mismanaged floor labor. She learned it all. Quietly, methodically. In 2009, she left Meridian and joined a company called Alderton Retail Holding. Alderton was not a name that meant anything to most people, not a name on any storefront. It was the parent company behind 11 retail chains spread across the Midwest and Southeast, quietly acquiring struggling department store brands for a decade. Denise joined as a regional operations director. By 2014, she was a senior vice president. By 2018, she was chief operating officer. She had never announced any of it. She did not have a personal brand. She did not give interviews. She drove a 4-year-old Volvo, wore her hair natural, and bought her cookware in person because she had learned from her mother that the weight of a pan told you more than any product description. Alderton Retail Holdings had acquired the Whitmores in 2021. All 47 locations, including the one in Eastfield Mall. She was not a customer in that store. She was, in the most precise legal and organizational sense of the word, its owner. And Craig Novak had no idea. Now, let me tell you about Craig Novak and the world he believed he ruled. Craig Novak had managed the Whitmore's Eastfield location for 6 years. He was 41 years old, had a framed photograph of himself at a NASCAR event on his office wall, and operated the store floor with the confidence of a man who had never been seriously questioned in his professional life. He had been passed over for district manager twice and had decided, somewhere in the architecture of his reasoning, that the decisions above him were made by people who did not understand the realities of the floor. Craig Novak had a loss prevention philosophy he had never written down and never examined. It operated on pattern recognition, he would have said, if asked. The patterns he recognized were not random. The Whitmore's Eastfield store served a mixed-income customer base in a neighborhood that had been gentrifying unevenly for a decade. Craig had developed a habit of assigning his part-time security guard, a young man named Devin Harris, 23 years old, who needed the income, to shadow customers Craig identified as risks. The criteria were invisible to any formal policy document. Devin Harris knew what the criteria were. He had known since his first week. He had followed those instructions with the particular misery of a young man who needed the job and hated what it sometimes required. The morning Denise Okafor walked into the store, Devin had been positioned near the entrance by Craig's instruction before she had taken 10 steps inside. He had watched her move through the linen section. He had followed her into housewares. He had stood 12 feet behind her for 11 minutes pretending to adjust a display of dish racks while she read labels with the unhurried focus of someone who had nowhere more important to be. Devin Harris had not wanted to be there. He had felt the wrongness of it the way you feel a splinter. Small, specific, impossible to ignore. He had looked up once toward the service desk where Craig stood with his arms folded. Craig had given him a small nod. Devin had looked back at the floor. When Craig crossed the floor and spoke those words, loud, certain, performative, Devin Harris had gone very still. He watched Denise set the saucepan back on the shelf. He watched her turn and look at Craig without flinching. And something in Devin shifted in that moment, the way weight shifts in a structure that has been under too much pressure for too long. Craig walked Denise toward the service desk with the bearing of a man conducting official business. The customers near the blender display watched. The woman in the yellow cardigan did not move. The store hummed with ventilation, refrigerated cases, piped music, and underneath all of it was a silence with a specific texture, the texture of people who had decided not to see something. At the service desk, Craig asked Denise for her receipt. She had not purchased anything yet. He knew that. He asked anyway. He said, "I'm going to need to see what's in your bag before you continue shopping." He said it with the flat authority of a man who believed the request was reasonable because he had made it before and no one had stopped him. Denise Okafor looked at him for a moment, just a moment. Then she set her bag on the counter. A structured leather tote, dark brown, chosen for its functionality and used for years, and unzipped it herself, slowly. She removed a legal pad, a folder of documents, a phone, a corporate card in a slim leather holder. She laid each item on the counter with the deliberate patience of someone who had nothing to hide and everything to remember. Craig Novak looked at the items. His expression did not change. He said, "I'm still going to need to verify your identity." Devin Harris was standing 8 feet away. He had watched every second of it. He looked at the folder of documents on the counter. He looked at the corporate card. He looked at the name embossed on its front, and something in his chest tightened into a specific shape. Not quite recognition, not yet, but close, and it was about to get worse. Craig Novak called for a second security guard over the store radio in front of the small cluster of customers who had drifted toward the service desk. He said, loud enough for all of them to hear, "I've got a situation at the front desk. I need backup." The word situation landed in the air of that store and did not dissipate. Denise Okafor stood with her hands resting flat on the counter. Her breathing was even. Her shoulders were level. She had learned over 22 years that the moments requiring the most stillness were the ones that felt the most like motion. She told herself what her mother had told her. She stayed low. The second guard arrived, an older man named Ray Kowalski, who had worked retail security for 18 years and had the look of someone who had seen enough to be tired of most of it. He came around the corner, took in the scene, and his eyes moved from Craig Novak to Denise Okafor to the items on the counter. His gaze stopped on the folder. It stopped on the corporate card. It stopped on the name. Ray Kowalski had been in retail long enough to know what an Alderton Holdings corporate card looked like. He had processed one before, at a different location, during an unannounced operational audit. He knew the card. He knew what it meant. He looked at Craig Novak. He said very quietly, "Craig, I think you need to stop." Craig Novak did not stop. He said, "Ray, I've got this handled." He turned back to Denise and said, "Ma'am, I'm going to ask you one more time to verify your identity before I have to involve mall security." Denise Okafor reached into the folder. She removed a single document, a laminated identification card on a lanyard, with a photograph and a title and a company seal. She placed it on the counter next to the corporate card. She did not say anything. She did not need to. The laminated card read Denise A. Okafor, Chief Operating Officer, Alderton Retail Holdings. Craig Novak looked at it the way a man looks at something he cannot immediately process, not with comprehension, but with the early stages of it, the part that precedes understanding and feels like the ground moving. His arms, folded across his chest since he walked across the floor, came apart. He put one hand on the counter. Ray Kowalski took a step back. Devin Harris, 8 feet away, looked at the floor. The woman in the yellow cardigan, who had drifted to within 15 feet of the service desk, saw the card. She read the title. She looked at Craig Novak. She looked at Denise Okafor. She did not look away. Denise Okafor had said 11 words since Craig Novak first approached her. 11 words total. She had not raised her voice. She had not accused him of anything. She had simply placed the truth on the counter and let it sit there. Craig Novak's face had changed. The certainty, that particular, practiced certainty that had carried him through 6 years of managing that floor, had gone somewhere it was not coming back from. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He opened it again and said, I wasn't aware. Denise Okafor picked up the corporate card. She picked up the laminated ID. She picked up the legal pad and the folder and the phone. She placed them back in her bag one at a time with the same deliberate patience she had used to remove them. She zipped the bag. She looked at Craig Novak for a long moment. Not with anger, not with contempt, with something quieter and more permanent than either. Then she turned and walked back toward the housewares aisle. She picked up the copper-bottomed saucepan. She read the label on the bottom. She placed it in the crook of her arm. She never raised her voice, not once. But the document on that counter had said everything that needed to be said. Devin Harris watched her walk away. He watched Craig Novak standing at the service desk with his hand still on the counter and his certainty in pieces around him. Devin reached into his jacket pocket and found his phone. He thought about what Ray Kowalski had said. He thought about 11 minutes of following a woman through a store because of an instruction he had known was wrong from the first day he received it. He thought about his mother, who had worked a register in a store not unlike this one for 12 years, and what she had told him about dignity. He made a decision. He walked to the service desk. He picked up the store's internal incident log, a physical binder kept at the desk in which every security action was supposed to be recorded. He opened it to that morning's date. He wrote down what had happened, the time, the instruction he had received, the name on the corporate card, all of it, in his own handwriting with the date and his signature. He left the binder open on the desk and walked to the back office to find the number for Alderton Holden's regional compliance line. He had never called it before. He had known it existed. He called it now. The compliance line rang twice before someone picked up. Devin stood in the back corridor between a rack of returned merchandise and a fire door that smelled of rust and cold air, and he spoke in a low, careful voice. He gave his name, his employee number, the date and time, and the name he had read on that laminated card. All of it in order, without embellishment, the way a man gives a statement he knows will matter. The woman on the other end did not interrupt him. When he finished, she said, "I need you to hold, please." She said it with a flatness that was not dismissal. It was the flatness of someone writing very quickly. Devin held. He looked at the fire door. He thought about the incident log open on the desk out front, his handwriting in blue ink, his signature at the bottom. He thought about the fact that he had just done the one thing he had told himself. For months, he did not have the position to do. He did not know that the call would reach the desk of a man named Gerald Fitch within 40 minutes. Gerald Fitch was Alderton Holden's Vice President of Human Resources and Compliance, a careful, methodical man from Cincinnati who had spent 17 years in corporate governance and who treated every compliance report the way a surgeon treats a wound, with attention, with instruments, and without sentiment. He read back the name Devin had given him. He read it twice. Then he picked up his own phone and called the number he had not called in 6 months. Gerald Fitch had been present at Denise Okafor's final interview before her appointment as COO. He had sat in the room and watched her answer questions for 2 hours, with the same composure she had shown at that service desk, unhurried, precise, without performance. He had voted for her appointment without reservation. He believed, still, that she was the most operationally literate executive he had encountered in 2 decades of corporate work. When Denise picked up her phone in the housewares aisle, she had returned to the aisle, the copper saucepan still in the crook of her arm because she had come for a saucepan and she intended to leave with one. Gerald Fitch said, "Denise, I just received a compliance report from the Eastfield location." She said, "I know." He said, "Are you still in the store?" She said, "I am." He said, "I'm sending the regional director." Denise Okafor said, "Gerald, do it right." 4 words. She ended the call and went back to reading the label on the bottom of the pan. Gerald Fitch sat for a moment with the phone in his hand. He had worked with Denise for 4 years. He had never once heard her raise her voice. He understood from the weight of those 4 words exactly what she meant. Not fast, not loud, thorough, documented. Every mechanism that existed for exactly this kind of situation used exactly as it was designed to be used. He began making calls. The regional director for the Midwest Division was a woman named Patricia Owens. She had been in a meeting in a glass-walled conference room in Dublin, Ohio, when her phone lit up with Gerald Fitch's name. She excused herself, stepped into the hallway, and listened for 4 minutes without speaking. When Gerald finished, Patricia said, "I'll be there in 45 minutes. She was there in 38. Patricia Owens was 54 years old, had managed retail operations across 6 states, and had the bearing of someone who had made difficult decisions in front of difficult people for a very long time. She walked through the front entrance of the Whitmore's Eastfield store with the particular quiet of a person who does not need to announce themselves. She went directly to the service desk. She asked for the manager. Craig Novak came out of the back office. He had been sitting at his desk for 31 minutes since Denise had walked back to the housewares aisle, trying to reconstruct the morning in a way that made sense. He had not succeeded. He had the look of a man who had been waiting for something without knowing what shape it would take when it arrived. Patricia Owens introduced herself by name and title. She asked to see the incident log. Craig Novak looked at the open binder on the desk. Devin Harris's handwriting, Devin Harris's signature, the time and the instruction and the name on the corporate card, all of it in blue ink. And he understood in that moment that the morning had been documented before he had thought to consider what documentation might mean. He handed her the binder. She read it the way Gerald Fitch read compliance reports, with attention, with instruments, and without sentiment. Then she looked at Craig Novak and said, "I need you to remain available. Do not leave the premises." She said it without heat, without theater. She said it the way you say something you have the authority to say, and do not need to raise your voice to prove it. Craig Novak nodded. He put his hand on the counter again, the way he had at the service desk when the ground first moved beneath him, and he nodded. Patricia Owens found Denise Okafor in the housewares aisle. Denise had selected the copper-bottomed saucepan and a matching skillet and was comparing 2 sets of measuring cups with the same unhurried focus she had brought to everything else that morning. Patricia stopped beside her. She said, "Denise, I'm sorry." Denise looked at her. She said, "I know you are." Then she said, "Talk to Devin Harris first. He did the right thing." She placed the measuring cups back on the shelf, selected the set she wanted, and walked toward the register. She bought what she came for. She paid. She left. What happened next did not take long. It did not need to. The regional compliance investigation Gerald Fitch initiated that afternoon was not the first time Craig Novak's conduct had been reviewed. It was, however, the first time it had been reviewed with Devin Harris's written account attached, and with the name Denise A. Okafor in the header. Gerald Fitch's team pulled 6 months of security logs from the Eastfield location. They cross-referenced which customers had been shadowed, which had been stopped, which had been asked to produce receipts before purchase. The pattern was not subtle. It had never been subtle. It had simply never been examined with the instruments it deserved. The examination took 11 days. Records, interviews, and documented testimony from Devin Harris, from Ray Kowalski, and from 3 former part-time employees who had been asked, at various points in their employment, to follow Craig Novak's unwritten instructions and had left the job rather than continue. They had not said anything publicly. They had simply left. Their silence had not been complicity. It had been the silence of people who needed income and did not believe anyone would listen. Gerald Fitch listened. Patricia Owens listened. They put everything in writing. On the 12th day, Craig Novak was called into a meeting at the Alderton Holdings regional office. He came in his Whitmore's manager blazer. He sat across a table from Patricia Owens, a representative from the company's legal team, and a human resources officer he had never met. Patricia opened a folder and went through the findings section by section, in the same flat, instrument-precise voice she had used in the store. She did not editorialize. She did not need to. Craig Novak's employment was terminated that afternoon, not with anger, not with theater, with documentation, with process, and with the institutional weight of a company that had decided, through the correct mechanisms, that what had happened in that store was not an isolated incident and could not be treated as one. He was escorted from the regional office by a human resources officer. He left the building carrying a box with the NASCAR photograph and a coffee mug with a chip in the rim. He did not say anything on his way out. There was nothing left to say that the documents had not already said better. Devin Harris was not fired. He was called into a separate meeting with Patricia Owens and Gerald Fitch, and he sat across from them with his hands flat on the table and told them everything. The first week, the months in between, the 11 minutes in the housewares aisle, the incident log, why he had written it down. Gerald Fitch said, "You did the right thing. That took courage." Devin Harris looked at the table. He said, "I should have done it sooner." Patricia Owens said, "Yes." She said it without cruelty and without absolution. She said it the way you say something true that a person needs to hear and has already said to themselves. Then she said, "We'd like to offer you a position in the regional compliance office, entry level, training program, and a salary review at 6 months." Devin Harris looked up. He said, "Yes." Ray Kowalski gave a written statement and was thanked for his conduct. He retired from retail security 4 months later, on his own timeline, and went to work part-time at his son-in-law's hardware store in Hilliard. He said in his statement that he had worked retail security for 18 years, and that the moment he told Craig Novak to stop was the first time in those 18 years he had felt entirely certain he was doing his job correctly. He put that in writing. He signed it. The woman in the yellow cardigan had given her name to the compliance team voluntarily. She had approached Devin Harris before leaving the store that morning and handed him her name and phone number. "I saw everything," she said. "If anyone needs to know what happened, I'm available." Her name was Barbara Costin. She was a retired schoolteacher from Gahanna. She answered every question the compliance team asked with the precision of a woman who had spent 30 years teaching children that words have consequences. Her account matched Devin Harris's in every material detail. The investigation's findings were not made public by Alderton Holdings. Corporate compliance investigations rarely are. But the termination of a store manager and the restructuring of loss prevention protocols across 11 Whitmore's locations was not the kind of thing that remained entirely invisible. A regional retail trade publication ran a brief item about a significant compliance action at the Eastfield location. It did not name Craig Novak. It did not name Denise Okafor. It named the systemic pattern the investigation had uncovered and the policy changes that followed. That was enough. In the world Craig Novak had moved through for 6 years, the item was read by people who recognized the store and the location and drew the conclusions the facts supported. The calls he made in the weeks that followed, to district managers at competing chains, to former colleagues, to a regional HR contact he had cultivated over years, did not produce the results he had anticipated. The doors that had been open were not open in the same way. Some of them were not open at all. He had not been blacklisted. No one had made a call on his behalf or against it. The industry had simply read the item, drawn the conclusions, and moved on. That was how institutional consequence worked when it worked the way it was supposed to. Not with anger, not with revenge, with information, in the right hands at the right time. Denise Okafor did not attend the compliance meeting. She did not attend the termination. She did not issue a statement. She had asked Gerald Fitch to be kept informed, and she received the summary when it was complete. She read it. She filed it. She did not discuss it publicly. She did not discuss it privately, except once, on a Sunday afternoon in the Linden neighborhood of Columbus, sitting on the porch of the house on Myrtle Avenue, where the boards still creaked in the pattern her mother had memorized. 2 short, 1 long. Gloria Okafor was 71 years old and still had the hands of a woman who had worked with them for decades. She sat beside her daughter with a cup of tea and listened to the whole of it without interrupting. When Denise finished, Gloria was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You didn't say much." Denise said, 11 words. Gloria nodded. She looked out at Myrtle Avenue, at the maple tree that had been there since before Denise was born. She said, "The work spoke." Denise said, "It did." They sat there in the late afternoon light, in the particular quiet of people who do not need to fill silence, and the porch boards did not creak because neither of them was going anywhere. The reckoning did not announce itself. That is the nature of institutional consequence when it is done correctly. It does not arrive with noise or theater. It arrives the way a tide arrives, methodical and irresistible, filling every space left open by years of unchecked assumption. In the weeks that followed, Alderton Holdings did not issue a press release. Patricia Owens did not give an interview. Denise Okafor did not speak to a journalist or post a word on any platform. The company did what companies do when operating through their best mechanisms rather than their worst impulses. It documented, it acted, and it changed the conditions that had allowed the harm to accumulate. The loss prevention protocols across all 47 Whitmore's locations were rewritten, not amended. Rewritten. The new policy required that any customer stop or identity verification be documented in real time, with the specific reason recorded before the interaction, not after. Any instruction to shadow a customer had to be issued in writing and approved by a compliance officer. Every employee in a security or floor management role was required to complete a bias awareness training program within 60 days, with annual refreshers. The policy was not named after the incident. The people who wrote it knew what had made it necessary, and they wrote it with that knowledge in every clause. The training program was developed in consultation with an outside firm specializing in retail equity compliance. It was not a gesture. It was a curriculum, tested and revised over 3 months, mandatory at every level of floor management across the chain. Patricia Owens oversaw its implementation personally. She visited 9 locations in the first quarter. She asked questions. She listened. She made notes in her leather portfolio and followed up on every one of them. Devin Harris began his position in the Regional Compliance Office on a Monday morning in early spring. He arrived 20 minutes early. He sat in the training room with a legal pad and a pen. A legal pad, the same kind Denise Okafor had placed on the service desk counter that morning, and wrote the date at the top of the first page. Gerald Fitch stopped by before the training started. He said, "You're going to be good at this." Devin looked at the legal pad. He said, "I'm going to try to be." The salary review at 6 months came back with a raise and a commendation in Devin's personnel file, citing his documentation of the incident and his voluntary compliance report as demonstrating professional integrity under pressure. He read it twice. He folded it and put it in his jacket pocket. He called his mother that evening and told her about the raise. He did not tell her about the commendation. She had raised him to know the difference between doing the right thing for recognition and doing the right thing because it was the right thing. Ray Kowalski's written statement remained in the compliance file, signed and dated, a piece of the permanent record. He was not celebrated. He had not asked to be. He had done what a man of 18 years' experience should do when he sees something wrong, and he had done it once, clearly, and that was enough. Some mornings, behind the counter of the hardware store in Hilliard, he thought about the moment he had said those 4 words. "Craig, I think you need to stop." And he thought about the fact that he had waited a beat too long before saying them. He carried it the way an honest person carries the things they wish they had done sooner. Not as shame, but as instruction. Barbara Costin received a letter from Alderton Holdings 3 months after the investigation closed. It thanked her for her cooperation and her willingness to provide a witness account. It was signed by Patricia Owens. Barbara read the letter at her kitchen table and pinned it to the corkboard above her desk, between a photograph of her last class and a card from a former student who had gone on to law school. She had spent 30 years teaching children that what you say and what you do in a public moment carries weight. She had not needed the letter to know that, but she kept it anyway. Craig Novak did not find another management position in retail. Not in the first year, and not in the second. He found work eventually, a logistics coordinator role at a warehouse distribution center in Reynoldsburg, a job that required none of the floor authority he had built his professional identity around. The industry had simply read what was available to read and made its calculations. He had managed a floor for 6 years on the assumption that the people above him were too distant and the people below him were too powerless to matter. He had been wrong on both counts. He had been wrong in the most specific, documented, and permanent way a person can be wrong. And Denise Okafor went back to work. She went back to the meetings and the quarterly reviews and the operational decisions that kept 47 stores running. She went back to the 4-year-old Volvo and the legal pads and the corporate card in its slim leather holder. She did not speak about what had happened in the Eastfield store in any professional setting. The policy changes spoke, the training program spoke, the compliance file, sealed and permanent, spoke. The work spoke. She kept the copper-bottomed saucepan. It sat on the stove in her kitchen in the Short North neighborhood of Columbus, and she used it the way her mother had taught her to use a good pan, with attention, with patience, and without rushing the heat. On a Sunday afternoon in late autumn, she drove to Myrtle Avenue. The maple tree had gone full amber, the kind of color that only lasts a few days before the cold takes it. She sat on the porch with her mother, and Gloria had her tea, and the boards creaked in the pattern that had not changed in 40 years. 2 short, 1 long. They did not talk about the store. They had already said what needed to be said. They sat in the amber light and the particular silence of people who have earned their rest, and the maple tree held its color for one more afternoon before the wind came. Now, I want to say something directly to you, because this story is not unique. It is not a rare exception or an extraordinary case. It is one version of something that happens every day in stores and offices and lobbies and parking lots to people who have built extraordinary lives in silence and are met in an ordinary moment with the assumption that they do not belong. The assumption does not ask for credentials. It does not wait for evidence. It arrives fully formed, certain of itself, and it lands on the shoulders of people who have learned, who have had to learn, to carry it without breaks in. What Craig Novak saw when he looked at Denise Okafor was not a person. It was a category. And what Denise Okafor understood in the 22 years she had spent building something real and invisible and permanent was that the category was not her problem to solve. Her job was to stay low, build high, let the work speak when she could not. The work spoke. The question I want to leave you with is this. How many times does this happen to someone who doesn't have the document in their bag? Who doesn't have the title on the card? Who is treated exactly the same way, with exactly the same certainty, and has no institutional mechanism to reach for, only their own dignity, and the silence of a crowd that has decided not to see? Because the dignity was always there. It did not depend on the card. It did not depend on the title. It was there when she set the saucepan back on the shelf and turned without flinching, and it would have been there even if the folder had held nothing but a grocery list. That is what I want you to think about. Drop a comment and tell me. Have you ever been in a room where someone was treated as less than they were, and you stayed still, or were you Devin Harris, the person who finally picked up the pen? I want to hear it. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you wanted to keep finding the people the world overlooked, the ones who built in silence and let the work speak, subscribe and come back. We find these stories every week. They are everywhere if you know how to look.